We've spoken about fabricated terror many times on RichPlanet before. In brief, this is where terrorist acts are staged by a state for some strategic purpose. The false narrative of such events, which is usually put out by controlled media outlets, forms a key role in fabricated terror. Here to talk about the recent alleged coup in Turkey, follies in the Middle East, admitted or proven staged terrorist acts across the world, Operation Gladio, so-called Islamic terrorism, and ISIS. Welcome on to the show, Zaid.
Hi, Richard.
Now then, you've got a physics background, a degree in physics, but we're not going to talk about physics today. We're going to talk about, well, the politics of the Middle East and alleged false flag operations. Now, the first thing you wanted to cover was the coup in Turkey that we've all heard about in our media. And we've got various different accounts of what may or may not have happened there. So just, can you first start off by giving us the sort of official mainstream opinion or view on what may have happened in Turkey?
Yeah, so throughout the media there are all kinds of different opinions, but to get a good yardstick of the mainstream opinion, BBC News had an article called Turkey Coup, Who Was Behind the Turkey Coup Attempt, where they discuss a few, I would say, conspiracy theories regarding the Turkey coup. So they had three main theories on that article. Mm-hmm. The first was it was a false flag orchestrated by Erdogan himself, mm-hmm. Which I think is a bit far-fetched.
He's the president.
He's the president.
So he set up this controlled opposition to make it look like they've tried to overthrow him. Right?
Yeah, in order to solidify his power over Turkey.
Right.
I don't think they really have any evidence for that, and I think it's quite telling that outside the West, the mainstream media is very all for conspiracy theories and false flags, but when it comes to anything that happens in the US or America, it's a completely different story. So there's no consistency there. Another theory they had was that the Gulenists who support Fethullah Gulen were tricked by the military in staging the coup. So the Gulenists were tricked by the Kemalists in the military to stage it. I think it paints the Gulenists as victims. So again, I think that having that theory on that article is quite telling as to who's being supported. And the third theory is that the Gulenists were tipped off that the government was going to conduct mass arrests, essentially, and that's why they were pushed into doing the coup. Again, these theories kind of paint the Gulenists in a kind of victim status, and I wouldn't take them seriously at all, because every single coup that Turkey's ever had has been CIA backed, and it's always followed the same narrative. It's always, whenever Turkey does anything that may distance itself from the Western strategic interests and NATO interests, and the fact that they don't have any kind of theory in that article that even mentions the US or the CIA or anyone like that is telling it itself.
Right. So the BBC spreading conspiracy theories again, and so you think the CIA were probably involved, as they have been in many other coups around the world in the past, which we're going to come on to. So what would be the motivation for this coup if the CIA were behind it?
Yeah, so I was sending you updates about the coup from day one, and I mentioned Gulen's name came up in the media, but I mentioned to you that he's more so the ranking sock puppet rather than the actual, the mastermind behind the coup. He's quite a convenient character to have. He's based in a compound in Pennsylvania in the United States. He has a network of charter schools all over the world, 120 of which are in the United States. He's understood to be more of an Islamic radical than how Erdogan is painted out in the West. The coup actually happened 3 weeks after, I would say, Erdogan decided to grow a pair and defy NATO strategy by thawing his relationship with Russia. And there is an article that talks about that. But I think the formation of the coup happened a lot longer, than that. At the end of March, start of April, US military families were being evacuated from Turkey. So that could be seen as part of that preparation for the coup.
Right. So there was things going on, happening, movement of people before this happens. So potentially people knew about it or knew that something was going to happen. I noticed that I woke up one morning and it was all over the media, and they seemed to have far too much detail about this coup, how many troops were involved, what had happened, this, a storm there, and all the rest of it. I'm thinking, well, I don't trust that, because there's just far too much immediate detail in the BBC coverage of it, so seems like it might be staged. But Turkey's allegiance with East or West is very important. Tell us why that is the case, and you think this coup was an absolute failure because it's actually pushed Turkey possibly further towards Russia?
Absolutely. You know, I predicted to you again in another email that Turkey would switch sides over to the Russian camp, and they very well did that. Although Erdogan, he joined the Syrian war, you know, there was absolutely no reason for them to go against Syria. And he kind of supports these, you know, these extremists that are operating in Syria. I think from the American perspective, he didn't quite push it well enough. So as a potential puppet leader on behalf of NATO, probably the Americans weren't satisfied with that, which is why they wanted somebody who was more malleable, essentially. There are things around the Gaza flotilla raids, relations with Israel, and that probably upset them. So you know, the coup was staged to get a more receptive person in power, but what actually has happened is the CIA, they've shot themselves in the foot, and they've pushed the Turkish even further into the Russian camp. And what it's actually done is it's actually kind of thawed a centuries-long animosity that the Russians and Turks had with each other. You know, the Ottoman Empire is on the south side of the Black Sea, and the Russian Empire and then Soviet Union is on the north side of the Caspian Sea, and there were always kind of disagreements and wars and territorial grabbings for areas such as Crimea, Armenia, the Caucasus, all those kind of areas. They've launched Turkey and Russia into this kind of, you know, strategic relationship. In terms of the future, the United States and Israel cannot afford to have Turkey on the side of, you know, Russia, Syria, and Iran, because it would result in a geostrategic nightmare. Essentially, Turkey's got a very powerful military. It's got a very good, strong economy. It's got a large population. The Islamic fundamentalist fighters who are operating in the north of Syria, it seems like they're filtering into the south of Turkey, and they're creating all kinds of trouble in Turkey. So I think we still haven't seen the end of the trouble in Turkey, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Putin there. So you're of the mind that, because I've spoken about puppet leaders and Obama being a puppet and Cameron being a puppet, and there's this hidden power group. You think Putin is his own man? Just clarify that for us.
Well, yeah, everything I can see about Russia is that Putin is the top of the pyramid in Russia, essentially. I haven't personally seen any evidence to say that.
So you don't think there's any kind of either mafia or like if you take RT, for example, Russia Today, that's supposedly state Russian news channel, but it's full of disinformation. So why would Putin allow a program like RT to be produced? Because it's not giving you the same message as the BBC,
right,
but it's Western propaganda, in my opinion.
You're right.
So why wouldn't Putin get rid of RT? I know I'm digressing here.
No, yeah, I agree with you. RT's full of disinformation. What we'll see in today's show is we will clarify without a shadow of a doubt that staged terrorism is one of the tools of statecraft in the modern era, as it were. People who are in the same business, they don't give away trade secrets. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Russia today presents, pro-Western propaganda. I think it does present a lot of the same propaganda that plays down staged terrorism. And the Russians have been caught staging terrorism in the Caucasus region, the South Caucasus as well as the North Caucasus. North Caucasus isn't part of Russia. It's part of the colonization effort that Russia had. You know, Russia isn't this kind of lovely, friendly entity. It's very much like America. So I would say a lot of the secrets that Russia today doesn't give away is because it would only stand to lose, because Russia is involved in a lot of the same kind of dirty tricks that other states are involved with, namely staging terrorism. They've staged Chechen terrorism. They've done all kinds of things. Right. I've seen a lot of speeches of Putin, and he's a very good speaker. I would say he's probably the most foremost politician of our era. But he's very clever with the way he talks. He's very clever when he talks about the Caucasus region. You know, he always says our Caucasus region. He's always, you know, repeating the same things over and over again. So what I say with regards to Russia today, they've got a stake in suppressing, you know, staged terrorism, definitely.
Right. And you mentioned Putin talking. There's a lot written about him, and he's criticised for being this, that, or the other in our media. But you see very little of him actually just sitting, talking, and giving him the airtime to say what he really means. There's a lot of interpretation on what people say he means.
Absolutely, yeah.
But when have you seen him interviewed by a Paxman at length? You know
Absolutely.
what I mean? And I'm sure he would come on Newsnight and be interviewed by a Paxman, Putin, wouldn't he?
Absolutely.
You know, there's no reason not to.
Yeah. I think myself and yourself, we've seen a lot of speeches from Putin, so we know a lot about what he's all about. But I think, like you say, the population of the West, just completely they're kept in the dark about who Putin is, what he represents, and what he's talking about. So yeah, absolutely, I'd agree with you.
So it's just reiterate, why is Turkey so important then for the Western powers to have on their side rather than on Russia's side? What's the significance of it?
So again, Turkey's a very powerful military. It controls sea lanes, you know, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The influence of Russia started, you know, after the Ottoman Empire. You know, with the rise of Ataturk, you know, Ottoman power was essentially neutralized, and so the Turks stopped becoming their own power, and they started becoming a subservient power to external forces. So with the following World War II and the outbreak of the Cold War, the United Kingdom was facing a lot of financial difficulties, you know, near bankruptcy after World War II, and the mantle of world's dominant superpower was peacefully passed from the United Kingdom to the United States, and the United Kingdom requested that the United States provide Greece, in particular, with military and economic aid that it couldn't afford anymore in order to stem the expansion of the Soviet Union. And the policy that the United States took was to provide Turkey and Greece, you know, pretty much equal or, you know, leveled support. And, you know, we see the installation of nuclear warheads in Turkey, and, you know, Turkey being a NATO member. So Turkey is there, you know, to manage a lot of operations going on in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, you know, and facing Russia.
And what about Syria and this thing called ISIS that we hear about all the time? Would a puppet president in Turkey be used for whatever's going on in Syria?
Absolutely.
So just explain a bit more about that. Why would they need someone who's malleable with regards to what's going on in Syria, in Turkey?
Yeah, well, you know, I would say it's reasonable to say that the Islamic fundamentalists are the foot soldiers of globalist interests. You know, everywhere they seem to go, you know, it's always a convenient victory for globalization. You know, Libya is a perfect example, in Syria. So Turkey, you know, is probably being used as a conduit to provide ammunition and weapons to those people.
Can we move on to Iran now? Have you finished?
Yeah.
Right. So you wanted to discuss what you describe as follies, which is where you say either power has been grabbed, or you know, the leadership has changed due to staged coups or other events that have happened in various countries in the Middle East. So you wanted to first talk about Iran.
Yeah, so to finish off the Turkey situation, there was once a time when the United States was pretty good with coups. What we're seeing is, you know, the increasing incompetence of the intelligence services of the United States. What they've essentially done is they've shot themselves in the foot with Turkey. They've actually pushed them further into the foreign camp. And in the alternative media in particular, there's this kind of narrative that the elite power structure are, you know, very powerful. You know, they're omnipotent essentially, and, you know, they're super intelligent, this, that, and the other. And I think that's not a counterproductive or an accurate view of, you know, the power structures that work in the world. So Turkey is a great example of how intelligence services make big mistakes, and then moving on to other follies. You know, Iran would be another good example of that.
So you want to go back to 1941 in Iran? Just tell us what happened there.
Yeah, so in 1941, Iran was invaded by Britain and the Soviet Union, who ousted the Shah of Iran, so the Shah's the king, and they replaced him with his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And Pahlavi was an ideal puppet leader, essentially. He was, was never a true leader in the sense, of being the top of the pyramid. He'd rather flee the country and wait somewhere safe until, the US would suppress any uprisings and then just return to sit on his throne. He presided over Iran as it was being raped of its resources, particularly with oil in the form of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So we have a situation in 1941. The power structure of Iran has, been taken out. They install a puppet leader who is then presiding over the country as its resources are kind of being taken, from the people into the hands of, the globalist forces. Iran, there was a westernization process in Iran, to kind of, remove some of the more traditional aspects of the country, the Islamic religion and all that kind of thing. And also there was a push, obviously, to have a democratically elected government. So there was a democratically elected government led by Prime Minister Mossadegh, who followed the wishes of the people, essentially, and he attempted to get rid of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1953. Which resulted in the CIA coup of 1953. So there's the same narrative. You've got a situation where the wishes of the people of a nation run counter to the wishes of the globalist corporatocracy, essentially.
So the 1953 coup in Iran, that's settled fact. You'll find it on Wikipedia. The CIA were running coups to try and take over foreign governments.
Yeah.
But you'll not find it with regards to Turkey.
Yeah. So at the time, it wasn't the Islamic boogeyman, it was the Soviet boogeyman, and Mossadegh was painted as a communist or a communist sympathizer, and the CIA was staging communist coups in the communist bombings in the country, creating all kinds of havoc, and eventually they were successful in ousting Mossadegh from power. So following this, the US had to ensure that that no democratic wishes of the populace would be ever implemented again, essentially, because this democracy that we were having around the world was running straight in the face of the wishes of the globalist powers. So the CIA helped Iran to set up the secret police known as the Savak.
So you would say that the CIA would rather install a malleable, ostensibly dictator, but is actually being controlled by them than have any kind of democracy. They'd rather have a puppet dictator, in other words. That's what they try and install in many countries.
Absolutely. The Savak were worse than anything that was claimed of Saddam or Assad or Gaddafi. And the simple reason for this is that the governments of those dictators may have been authoritarian, but they didn't depart that drastically from the wishes of the people. What Saddam wasn't doing is he wasn't selling out the country to a foreign power. He was a very authoritarian dictator, but the power was being held with the governments, and it trickled down, to a certain extent. Obviously, it wasn't a meritocracy by any means, but in Iran, the wishes of the people really being circumvented. The resources of Iran were being raped. Geopolitically, they were relying with Israel, which definitely didn't go well with the Iranian populace.
So what you're saying is that some of the dictators throughout the Middle East, for all they are absolute dictators, there is no democracy. They are, I guess, in order to hold on to their power, largely reflecting what the people want, whereas a puppet dictator is going by an agenda of an outside entity.
Force.
So which is worse?
I wouldn't go as far as saying that they are doing the wishes of the people, because I think if they were doing the wishes of the people, they would have a meritocracy, they would set up a democracy, that kind of thing. But I think what the mainstream like to do is they like to liken all dictators as these mad psychopaths who are hell-bent on taking the world, especially Assad. Assad inherited power from his father. And there probably were human rights abuses in Syria, but really, life in Syria wasn't bad. If you obeyed the law, you would get on with things. You know what I mean?
Okay, let's take Saddam. There's the clip of Saddam where he's he's fairly recently installed himself as the leader, and he's got the parliament there, and he's reading a list of names of all these people who've betrayed him, and they're taken out and they're shot, right, in front of everyone else. And all of the politicians are quaking in their boots because they're thinking, shit, is it going to be me next? I mean, that is absolute dictatorship, isn't it? So
yeah, absolutely.
So it's very hard to defend that as a regime, isn't it?
Absolutely, you know. But what happens in the mainstream media is they exaggerate, you know, offences, and they try and make it look like a certain country president needs to be ousted, essentially. And what happens is it gets replaced with something even worse, and even, you know, loads of bloodshed is shed. You know, there are better ways to kind of push democracy and push, you know, human rights and equality in a country than to label a dictator as a genocidal maniac, a Hitler-style genocidal maniac who's just, you know, all he wants to do is just kill his own people. You know, dictators rule through fear, but what they don't want to do is they don't want to create unnecessary enemies, both externally and internally. You know, all the dictators really cares about is for people to kind of to bow down to their wishes, and that's the crux of the situation. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think a lot of the time a lot of dictators are painted out to be these genocidal maniacs who just take pleasure out of, you know, murdering large groups of the population.
They're no different from a king of the 16th century in Britain. Which, you know, we probably wouldn't want to live under, to be honest. Absolutely.
No, I don't want to sit here and obviously defend, you know, dictators. But what I will say is, in Syria, there was a large Christian community. There were people of different religious denominations. You know, Assad doesn't care what people's religion is. That's the crux of the issue. People were getting along. You know, it was a very rich culture. It was quite secular. There was more or less freedom to, you know, to wear whatever kind of clothing you wanted. Now, what's happened is, following the intervention, you know, the Christians have had to flee. There's been all kinds of persecution, and it's just been replaced with something a lot worse. So this bleating, this humanitarian bleating from the West, it's not genuine at all. There's just absolutely no genuine aspect about it.
We'll come on to Syria, but you just wanted to touch on the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
Yeah. So again, this is another example where the intelligence services have just shot themselves in the foot, because they pushed with Iran so hard that there was an Islamic revolution in Iran in 1979, and the environment that they had was what led to that revolution in 1979, and then Iran turned into a staunch vanguard against America and Israel. It went from being an ally of Israel, you know, to Israel's number one enemy. So this geostrategic policy they're following, it's not logical. They're not, you know, the elites that we talk about, they are not kind of, you know, these super intelligent people. All they have to be is slightly more intelligent than the masses to get by. You know, they're very capable of making mistakes. Most of them don't really understand about the countries that they're involved in, and it's these kinds of mistakes that kind of, you know, come to light, you know, and get accepted in the mainstream.
So we come on to Iraq now, and obviously there were two wars. You know, you say that the second Gulf War was another folly or another mistake.
Yeah.
So tell us why.
So again, yeah, building upon the theme of, you know, the genocidal maniac narrative. Following the Iraq War, the United States made a lot of stupid decisions. You know, most notably going to war in the first place. The United States. You know, there wasn't one particular reason why the United States went to war with Iraq, but there were a few reasons, and one of the big reasons was obviously the oil in Iraq. The United States, I would say it's a declining empire, and invading Iraq and, you know, establishing control over that oil was a means of prolonging the life of that empire. And I think the way the United States went about invading Iraq, it bought itself a little extra time, but in the long term, it's actually kind of, you know, furthered its demise even more.
Because you would say that Saddam was actually a puppet as well, or to a degree. Even.
But people do say that he was a CIA asset, and, you know, people say this.
But he went AWOL. He went.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Do you think?
So in the alternative media, particularly, if they can establish some link with a dictator and, you know, being a CIA asset, that is just it. You know, there'll always be a CIA asset. for a lot of people, for a lot of leaders, the ends justify the means. So if you do have a particular leader who may have at one point been a recipient of CIA money, they may have justified that to themselves internally. Right, I'll take America's money and support, but what I will do is I'll build myself up, and one day I will get to the position of being, a leader of the Arab world, and we'll have a large Arab state, and we'll get America back, that kind of thing. Saddam, he did, try to assassinate George Bush, so he can't have been that much of of an asset. So some people try to see the world in kind of black and white terms, but there are a lot of complicated nuances as to how things work, and we need to take all of these things into account when we're building up a picture.
Right.
And that's that's the fundamental flaw in this kind of, a lot of these people talk about the Illuminati and the NWO. That's always going to be the flow. If you've got a power structure where a minority are trying to control the majority, they're always going to have this problem of defections. Most people aren't going to want them to be in power. Most people are going to defect. You're always going to have people who, who are going to fight against them. Israel's is known for being responsible for various extremist organizations in the Middle East, but being responsible or pushing forth them doesn't necessarily mean that those extremist organizations are tools of Israel. It means that those organizations, Israel may have thought it to be strategically beneficial to, support those organizations, but really the organizations turn into monsters essentially that
Right.
they can't control. And this is part of the, the flawed strategic thinking that happens when they want to fund these terrorist groups.
Right. Now, just to come back to Saddam Hussein, well, people would say, well, he was doing ethnic cleansing and killing Shias, mass graves, etc. Was he committing genocide?
So I would say that he didn't care whether someone was Sunni or Shia or Christian or whatever. So the Ba'ath Party itself was founded by a Christian, first of all. I would say that Saddam's primary wish was to maintain power. What we were having in the Iraq War particularly was Saddam constantly being likened to Hitler in terms of his mental state, and the Ba'ath Party being likened to Nazis essentially as being Nazis being genocidal maniacs and all this kind of thing. And that narrative, it's not constructive, and it's simply inaccurate. So they were unearthing mass graves following the Iraq War in the south of the country, mass graves of Shia, and it was painted by BBC News as an example of his genocidal tendencies. Now, the mass graves are there because George Bush Sr., following the 1991 Gulf War, he called upon the people of Iraq to rise up against Saddam. And I think they mainly did that to, cause Saddam a little bit of trouble. I don't really think they wanted to get him out of power at that point. If they wanted him out of power, they could have easily done it at that point in time. I think keeping the Saddam boogeyman there was very helpful. So what happened was George Bush calls upon the people of Iraq to rise up against Saddam. We'll support you. They did that. They got no support, and lots of people died. And that's where we see the mass graves. I'm not trying to excuse what he was doing. I'm trying to show that the narrative that constantly gets put out is incredibly inaccurate, and that inaccuracy can lead us to do stupid things. And we need to see these things in their proper context in order to build a good picture. I don't want to come across as being an apologist for dictators. Certainly.
Okay. So when Saddam was deposed, the Ba'ath Party was then banned, and you think that then brought about another problem by doing that?
Exactly. So this treating Ba'athists like Nazis, they treated them the same way. They banned the party, and that was a massive mistake to do, because they essentially removed the Sunni power structure from Iraq. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying from the point of view of the United States, it was another example of how they shot themselves in the foot. They removing that power structure created a lot of disenfranchised Sunnis, because they then found themselves in essentially a Shia country, and especially in Anbar there were kind of protests against the government of Iraq, and this I wouldn't say this is the start of ISIS, but I would say that this was used the ISIS situation piggybacked upon these protests, and this is the area where the Islamic State then, became established essentially.
I seem to remember reporting on the Iraqi deputy prime minister who had a murder squad, and he was going around blowing up like people in the government. That was all exposed on RT, not RT, on press TV. But it was never mentioned in
exactly because we've got good guys and bad guys, haven't we? It's a simplistic narrative that you're always going to get.
For a few years, his weapons were all coming from the Americans, and they were stored in Baghdad.
Yeah, there are stories.
And they were assassinating like the health minister and people like this.
I mean, it's power struggles that go on in the country subsequent to the Americans coming to power. A new power structure, the old power structure gets removed, and then a new power structure forms and coalesces. So we're still in kind of that proto stage where alliances are being made, people are being taken out. There were a lot of abuses, obviously. Pre and post the war. It's not a nice situation at all.
Right, well, we're going to come on to ISIS a bit later, but you wanted to move on to the Ukraine?
Yeah, again, I'll just touch upon Ukraine briefly. It's another example of, I would say Putin is a better politician than, a lot of other politicians that we have in the world. And he used all of the trouble that we had in the Ukraine to kind of grab Crimea back as part of Russia, as what it used to be. As part of the Soviet Union, but issues that they had in Ukraine resulted in Crimea being part of Russia now. So it's just another example of a folly, and things not quite going the way that the Western intelligence agencies and the Western power structures would want it to go. So Vladimir Putin has, he's benefited from that. What happened in Ukraine, and he's also now benefited with what happened in Turkey. He's got himself potentially a very powerful ally. The story hasn't finished yet with Turkey, but it's just another example of a mistake that's been made. So.
Yeah, okay. And is there anything more to cover on Syria?
I think we pretty much talked about it. We can go on to the false flag.
Right, all right. Now we're going to discuss now what you describe as admitted to or proven staged terrorist acts from around the world. I think I've covered one or two of these in talks that I've given in the past. Japan frames China prior to invading Manchuria. Just tell us about that. This is going back quite a few years, isn't it?
Yeah. So obviously the reason I've chosen this list of countries is I want to establish that states use and these staged terrorist acts, and they specifically do it prior to an invasion. And I want to kind of obviously build up a case to show that without a shadow of a doubt this is what happens. So
just to paraphrase, State A wants to take control or wants to nab State B, so it does a little fabricated event to make it look like State B has murdered some people on a particular incident, but they haven't. Staged by State A, which gives it all the excuse it needs to then go and do whatever it wanted to do in the first place.
Absolutely.
So, Hegelian dialectic, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
It's just not really playing by the Queensberry rules, shall we say. But
Absolutely.
It's gone on throughout the world for centuries, but a key part of that working is that the general masses of State A mustn't know that the initial act was done by State A.
Exactly.
And that involves control in the media, which in a dictatorship you already have, we know that. And here, well, the media is controlled through corporations. But it's an arm of fabricated terror.
Absolutely.
So we'll go through this list then. So we've got Japan.
Manchuria's swathe of lands is north of China proper and Korea, and it's east of Mongolia, essentially. And Japan increased its influence in the area from 1905 to 1930, but it needed what we know as, in the false flag world, a casus belli, a case for war, in order to launch a full-scale invasion and solidify control and completely annex Manchuria from China. Officers of the Army General Staff and the Kwantung Army, as well as members of the secret society known as the Cherry Blossom Society, conspired to stage a bombing on the railway line near the town of Mukden. This bombing was to occur less than a kilometre from the Chinese garrison, with the hope of luring them out and setting them up as aggressors. The explosion ended up being quite weak, and it wasn't able to destroy the railway line, but the army accused the Chinese dissidents and responded by invading and occupying Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. So the primary goal was to provide an excuse for the occupation of Manchuria in order to establish a puppet state, thereby solidifying their control of the eastern Eurasian coast by expanding upon already annexed Korea and effectively establishing a larger beachhead for potential future imperial expansion. This would then have served as a launching pad, for further expansion. So what I want to kind of show there is that we've got a state that is in the process of building its empire. It is the aggressor. It wants to kind of invade these other countries, and it's used to stage terrorist events. And this particular case, the reason I'm including it is it's part of what we would consider to be the Western mainstream narrative. It's it's out there in the open. It's accepted.
All right. So we're going to go on to another example now, which I think we mentioned with Nick Colostrom a little while ago. This is Germany versus Poland in the Second World War. Is that?
Yeah.
So Germany. So you think that Germany did some sort of fabricated terror event against Poland before invading? Yeah.
Again, it's well documented. Germany framed Silesian separatists prior to invading Poland. So to contextualise what happened here, with the outbreak of World War One. Obviously, we all know it started with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and it was done by a Yugoslavian assassin, or then to be Yugoslavian. The Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war against the Kingdom of Serbia, and Germany and Italy were in a defensive pact with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italy decided not to go to war because, again, it was a defensive pact and not an aggressive pact, but Germany used this as an excuse to declare war. The German Empire declared war on Russia in response to Russia mobilizing its army, and 2 days later, following that, Germany then declared war on France and invaded the neutral state of Belgium in order to bypass and encircle French defences. And the invasion of Belgium, I would say, is probably the biggest mistake in German history, because it would result in Germany losing a third of its territory, by the time it re-emerged as a cohesive state in, 1990. So what happened at the end of World War One was that Germany lost a bit of its territory to all the surrounding countries. It lost the Alsace-Lorraine region to France, which is arguably French anyway, and it lost certain territories, small territories, to Poland. So the context of this is the fact that there were these kind of ethnic tensions between German speakers and Polish speakers along the eastern part of Germany, which is mainly the state of Prussia. And it happened, this act of staged terrorism happened in a place called Silesia, which is it's like the little arm that sticks out of Imperial Germany, where there were obviously, Polish speakers as well as German speakers. In 1939, Germans dressed in Polish uniforms and seized the radio station at Gliwice, and broadcast an anti-German message in Polish to make it look like an act of Polish Silesian separatists. And this was part of a wider set of staged events known as Operation Himmler to set up Poland as the aggressor against Germany, which then led to the invasion of Poland at the outbreak of World War II. So there we have another example of one state framing another state in order to declare war.
Okay. Right, so we've got several more that we're going to go through. Russia framing Finland, US terror bombings in Iran.
Russia frames Finland prior to invading Karelia. The Soviet Union shelled one of its own villages on the Finnish border, known as Mainila, and it blamed the Finnish for doing it, and it used it as an excuse to go to war with Finland. US terror bombings in Iran. Yeah, so we touched upon Iran earlier. All of the CIA staged bombings, which were blamed on communists, and supposedly Mossadegh was the one orchestrating it, have been admitted. It's all admitted out in the open. It's it's well known as being staged.
Just to touch on something more recent, which might be staged, the MH17 incident.
Right.
I saw one article on an alternative site saying that they thought that Russia had commissioned this German private investigator to try and find out who was really behind that.
Right.
Because I think Russia's been blamed for that. Is it? Am I right in thinking that?
I'm not really particularly sure about it.
But anyway, I think that there's theories that that's a fabricated, another false flag, the MH17 thing, possibly.
But the important thing is that we can't just dismiss these things out of hand. I mean, you need to kind of look into these things and provide an argument. I think a lot of people who do dismiss certain events out of hand, they haven't really looked into the situation at all.
Okay, so where are we going to now, Zaid?
So another good example would be US and Britain preparing, making preparations to frame Syria. I mean, obviously we've got all the trouble in Syria at the moment, so this is an example of planned staged terrorism. In 1957, the UK Prime Minister Harold Wilson and US President Dwight D. Eisenhower approved a plan to stage border incidents in preparation for an invasion. And again, Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, was the CIA chief at the time, and he was involved in both this and the stage bombings in Iran. And again, Syria was in control of one of the main pipelines that connected Iraq to Turkey. So again, we go back to oil.
There's been tensions in another part of the world over the years between Cuba, Latin America, and America, and there's been admitted false flag events with regards those nations. So just fill us in on that.
We probably don't have the time to go through all the terrorism that's happened in Cuba, Caribbean and Latin America, because it would need probably its own show to talk about it. It's just that extensive. But one kind of important thing I really want to talk about regarding this is that it's been admitted that the American Joint Chiefs of Staff approved a plan to blow up American airplanes and stage terrorist attacks on the mainlands and blame it on Cuba in order to justify an invasion. So again, it's just another example of how governments will, they will be perfectly happy to stage terrorism in order to use as an excuse. And we even have plans of, painting US aircraft in Cuban colors and attacking other Caribbean nations, blaming it on Cuba. So there's lots of things. There's also a publication called Special Forces Foreign Internal Defense Tactics, Techniques and Procedures for Special Forces that kind of outlines a lot of terrorist methodology to use in South America.
And the US were using these techniques in Vietnam as well, do you think?
Yeah, we've got the Gulf of Tonkin incident, right, which is, it's widely known as being a false flag that started the Vietnam War.
Right. So let's come on to the Cold War and Operation Gladio, which a lot of people I think have probably heard of. So this was mainly in Europe. So what was going on there with Gladio? What was the point of terrorist attacks with Gladio?
So you've got a mainstream narrative regarding Gladio that it was, you hear the same words over and over again, stay behind organizations. It was part of NATO's stay behind organization in the event of a Soviet invasion. You don't need stay behind organizations in places like Italy, or places like France or Belgium. They would have been given a lot of head notice if the Soviet Union was going to kind of like advance, to create those stay behind organizations. I believe Gladio is part of the same attempt to subvert democracy in general. You had a guy called Edward Bernays, who was the father of modern PR. And again, this was another way of trying to subvert democracy by essentially brainwashing people on a mass scale and, change the way they think and change their opinions in order to kind of manipulate democracy. I think Gladio was just the terrorist wing of that in Europe. A lot of the people wanted kind of what we'd consider like left-leaning policies, such as a removal of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, nobody wants nuclear weapons. No rational human being wants nuclear weapons on this planet. The only people who really want nuclear weapons are, power-hungry psychopaths, essentially, because they're so destructive. I think, I don't know if you can ask anyone, are you for nuclear disarmaments, across the world, if we could potentially do it. I don't think anyone would say no. They might say, oh, you know, it's not practical and this, that and the other. But
So with Gladio, who was the supposed enemy?
The boogeyman at that time was the Soviet Union and communists.
Right. So the story that was being told to the people when these terrorist events happened was it's terrorists who've got in from Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was an excuse to continue an arms build-up.
Yeah, it was an excuse to just, you know, solidify power, you know, by through terror essentially, and, you know, in scaring people. Especially in Turkey, it was used for ethnic cleansing. It was used to get rid of many Greeks who were living on the Anatolian, you know, mainland. You know, I write an article about it on my website about how the counter-guerrilla in Turkey, you know, which were part of Operation Gladio, were staging all kinds of bombings, assassinating students, torturing people.
Okay, so we come on to Islamic terrorism now, and we've had groups such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS. You wanted to start by just telling us about Wahhabism and Salafism.
Yeah, so...
What are they? Because I don't know what they are.
Wahhabism is named after a guy called Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab, who was... he founded this fundamentalist movement in the Arabian Peninsula, and he allied himself with Muhammad bin Saud, who was the progenitor of the Saudi dynasty that we have today. With the rise, Britain and the United States have obviously got a long history of cooperation with the Gulf states, and these Gulf states have this kind of, you know, this mentality with regards to Islam. What Saudi Arabia was doing as it, you know, came onto the international stage, because previous to that, you know, Saudi Arabia, you know, had no importance to anyone. It hosted Mecca and Medina, the religious sites, but other than that, you know, it was a backwater in the Islamic world essentially. When the Muslims expanded out of the Arabian Peninsula, the Islamic capitals were centered around Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. You know, they weren't centered in the Arabian Peninsula. You know, the Arabian Peninsula is mainly desert. It doesn't support a large population. So with the discovery of oil, this kind of artificially, you know, projected these people who lived in these kind of backwater areas into the international stage. I don't want to be offensive about it, but you could say that they brought a lot of these kinds of you know, extreme viewpoints with them when they set up the state of Saudi Arabia, and they started exporting their ideology around the world. It's a new form of Islam essentially, and I would say it departs from a lot of traditional aspects of Islam, and we can go on to that when we talk about the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan.
What about Al-Qaeda? Do you want to?
I think it's pretty well established that they are, you know, that they were set up by the CIA, you know.
And you can tell us what that. I mean, I think it's common knowledge. It's the database.
Yeah, the base. Yeah, Al-Qaeda. Yeah,
so
yeah.
just explain that for those who don't know.
Well, yeah. Well, you know, it's the mainstream left. I think, you know, like your Michael Moore types people and all that kind of thing. You know, it's pretty accepted. It's not just the alternative media. You know, it's pretty accepted that, you know, this group was set up, you know, with Western intelligence agencies. You know, I don't think it's a contentious issue. I think it's pretty understood. And then a lot of people refer to ISIS as Al-Qaeda, rebranded essentially. So yeah, you know.
But it was Al-Qaeda itself means the list or the database, which was a list of Mujahideen fighters.
Yeah, yeah. It means
that the
base,
CIA
yeah.
had this list.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
And then they just took that name.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's not this. It's this enemy that is nebulous and it can pop up wherever you want, and you know. And obviously, the fighters, the Mujahideen fighters, were originally set up to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And then they were kind of a handy tool to have, you know, in other parts of the world. But, you know, I think a lot of the claims made about this group are quite, you know, fictitious.
So you mentioned Islam, or traditional Islam, and more extreme Islam. You wanted to use the example of some Buddhist statues which are now in Islamic states, right, which Buddhism is not any way related to Islam, but they've just tell us they've respected that.
Yeah.
So just tell us about what you would say is the true Islam compared to a newer, more extreme is. So
yeah. First of all, I'm not in a position to say what the true Islam is. I think obviously religions are very complicated things, and people have different views. And so I don't want to treat it like a monolithic entity. But what I can say is what we'd consider as mainstream, the mainstream interpretation of the religion, especially from the Sunni side. The Taliban in Afghanistan, people are probably aware, blew up some Buddhist statues in that country and defaced them. With the logic of that, they're polytheistic, they insult God, all that kind of stuff. The argument that is passed around mainstream Muslims from the non-Western perspective is that the companions of the Prophet who lived during his time were the exemplars of what it is to be a Muslim. They were the best Muslims there could possibly be. So Muslims try to emulate these companions in every way they can, essentially. And the companions were there when Afghanistan became a Muslim country. These people were there. Nobody in the 1,400-year history of Islam has made the decision to blow up those statues. The world, probably other defacements, the Roman Catholic Church defaced statues because they disagreed with their beliefs. But the point I'm trying to make is just how deviant this fundamentalist new form of Islam is from mainstream thinking. Because I can imagine a lot of people in the West might think, how much support do ISIS have in the Middle Eastern world? And I would say most people in the Middle East are quite well aware. They have the opinion that ISIS is a CIA asset, because ISIS seem to do very unusual things when they carry out their executions, which is just bizarre. There are a million and one ways to execute someone, and ISIS tend to use methods that are specifically restricted in Islam, specifically classed as un-Islamic, like burning people alive. That's prohibited in Islam because you've got the religious idea of the hellfire. And that the idea, the logical thinking of it is that only God, burning people with fire is the punishment of God, essentially, so that people are kind of forbidden from doing it. So this is in religious texts, this, that, and the other. People are forbidden from burning ants even. And when a mainstream Muslim audience in the Middle East in particular witness something like a Jordanian pilot being burnt alive, they're going to immediately cry suspicion. They're going to cry foul, essentially, because it just doesn't make any sense. It's as if they're going out of their way to particularly execute people in an un-Islamic way. So for a Muslim audience, it doesn't really make much sense. And again, this priest that was, with the reports of the priest being killed in France. It's well established in the Islam isn't a religion of peace. It's a religion of peace and war. It's a religion that covers everything. It covers all aspects of life. It has many different rules, and one of the rules of war, there are books of war essentially that go through the kind of the ethics that they're supposed to have, is a prohibition in killing clergymen. So the fact that these people killed this man, especially a priest, it's very unusual. Right. And to a Muslim audience, that looks very suspicious.
So you actually sent me a quote, and is this from the Quran, or is it an Islamic quote?
Have I included it?
I've got it here.
All right.
So this
hadith, probably.
So Zaid emailed me this to say, well, this is not people who are following Islam that have done this. You said this is a quote: "Stop, O people, that I may give you 10 rules for your guidance in the battlefield. Do not commit treachery or deviate from the right path. You must not mutilate dead bodies, neither kill a child, nor a woman, nor an aged man." So it was an aged man that was killed, the priest. Yeah. "Bring no harm to the trees, nor burn them with fire, especially those which are fruitful. Slay not any of the enemy's flock, save for your food. You are likely to pass by people who have devoted their lives to monastic services, i.e. priests. Leave them alone." So that's a quote from. It's
a hadith, and it's one of the rightly guided caliphs. Essentially, in Sunni Islam, they have to, Sunnis believe in these after the Prophet died, in these 4 rightly guided leaders of the Islamic world, and their rules and their kind of advice is treated very seriously. And these supposed Islamic extremists are Sunnis and they're not Shia, and it's just very unusual what's actually happening. The way the way these executions. Right. It's bad enough killing someone in Islam. There's also a saying, someone who murders one person, it's as if they've murdered all of humanity. So right. Murder is prohibited.
What do you say to people who say, well, the Quran says that you have to kill people who don't follow the Quran?
I'd say take everything in context. I'm not a particularly religious person myself. I would say take everything in context. I don't want to get into a religious discussion because I don't really have a particularly strong opinions. I think different people have their kind of different beliefs, this, that, and the other. But I would just say it's very unusual.
This was mentioned on the last show, with Tony Bennett. Are they killing in the name of their God, of Allah?
Well,
is that what they're doing, this is just someone who's taken that word and perverted it and used it for fabricated terror?
Definitely, people are going over to Syria to fight for the Islamic State. These fighters aren't holograms or anything. They are real people.
They're mercenaries, according to Putin. They're being paid.
Well, so I would say that the model that some people use for the kind of people who go over there, because I think it would be hard for anyone to kind of try and put themselves in the shoes. Why would somebody want to join something like as horrific as ISIS? I think a lot of the people who join ISIS, a lot of them suffer from identity crises. They don't feel, part of the society that they live in. They tend to not have a very good knowledge of Islam, especially, about people call themselves Christian. They don't, a lot of them don't have the first clue about Christianity. They may have not even read the Bible. It's the same for all religions. You've got Jews who say they're Jewish and they don't know anything about Judaism. It works the same with Islam. Just because someone's Muslim doesn't mean the first thing about what the religion is supposed to say. So if you have these young people who, for whatever bizarre reason they'd want to do this, going over, that them committing these acts, they may not be aware of this. I'm not sure about the exact mechanisms, but obviously from the top, not everyone in ISIS is in on a conspiracy. But I think in the top, what Putin says, these people are mercenaries. They're paid. Congress approved a payment of $700 million to moderate Syrian rebels. And, that went into the hands of people like ISIS. Let me ask
you this question. If the CIA or whoever's orchestrating this, assuming it is that the way you say, what's their ultimate goal in that region then, in Syria?
To destabilise it.
And then what?
Well, the destabilisation of all the regions around Israel works to its benefit. Removing of the governments. Just creating general havoc. If all the other states are just in a state of disarray.
But is the plan then to bring some sort of stability and rid those countries of their natural resources, or what's the ultimate goal?
I think ideally, I think also that the way the planning works is dynamic. They may want to do something, but it might not have the desired effect. So then they'll change the tactics. I'm talking about the elites when they'll change the strategy to modify what happened that wasn't quite how they meant it to happen. I think the ultimate goal for Syria will be to establish some kind of puppet state, very similar to kind of like a Saudi or Saudi regime.
So all right, let me ask you this then: why don't they just send in people to assassinate Assad if they wanted to do that?
Because they don't have that kind of power. Intelligence agencies are primarily people in buildings pushing pens, and they have handlers and they have people on the grounds, and they're not these kind of omnipotent powers. People tried to assassinate Saddam, and it was very difficult because of the way he had his power structure. He had decoys, all that kind of thing. It's not that simple to go in and assassinate people. You hear of the economic hitmen and the jackals and all that kind of thing. Assassination is an option, but when intelligence agencies aren't these powerful things. They primarily wield their power through fear and manipulation. It's not that easy to kill a head of state.
Because someone like Chavez, it's alleged that they poisoned him with a cancer virus.
Right.
You know,
I'm not sure about that.
You don't. What you think? He just died of cancer. He claimed
Exactly.
He claimed that he'd been poisoned to be given cancer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
And he
it's
had
definitely
been targeted prior to that as well.
Absolutely. I'm not discounting it. I'm just saying I haven't done the investigation into it, so I wouldn't particularly have an opinion. But absolutely, you know, Chavez was, you know, a major pain for their geopolitical interests in South America, and they weren't able to subdue him so easily. So I think, you know, again, in the alternative media, a lot of people tend to basically paint these people out like they're kind of like these demigods who, you know, have got this master plan, this, that, and the other. You know, I'm not a believer in the Illuminati and the NWO in the terms of some all-encompassing group that's actually in control of Putin, it's in control of, you know, Ahmadinejad and all those people. I think the power structures do exist, and these wars, you know, are between, you know, different sides. If we did have an organisation, absolutely. If we did have a situation where we had an Illuminati who had ultimate control, what's stopping them from having a 1984 style state already? You know, the fact that we can talk about this shows that isn't true. You know, they have a certain amount of power, but their power is through particular conduits, and it's limited. And that obviously, it gives us a sense of hope, obviously, that we can make the world a better place. And, you know, we don't have a hopeless situation, essentially.
Well, and just, and what about France? Because with the Paris attacks, because they immediately blame that on this ISIS. Just give us your opinion on the Paris attacks, and because people who buy mainstream newspapers, they see that, they go, oh, well, we've got to go and invade that country because they did this Paris thing. And it's just simple. It's just simple. That's it. They're Islamic. They're mad. They did this to France. We've got to go and bomb the shit out of them. So what do you say to that?
Right. So first of all, there's also the mainstream narrative of the left that says, you know, bombing people doesn't do anything good. You know, you have a lot of, you know, Western leftist commentators of the West who say that. Second of all, I can't comment on specific attacks because I don't know what happened. You know, ultimately, what I can say is you can't say it's unreasonable for anyone to think that these things are staged. Given everything we've just talked about in this episode, the mainstream media tries to portray anyone who deviates from the mainstream narrative as being like a crazy person.
Yeah, to say that the events are staged.
It's absolutely
crazy.
Yeah. And this flies in the head of, you know, freedom of thought, essentially, because people are essentially committing thought crimes because they dare question, you know, an official narrative, and that isn't healthy for any society. What I would say is I find suspicious about what's going on in France is that some time ago you had the wars for independence of, you know, countries like Algeria and Tunisia and all that kind of thing, when, you know, they were kind of wrestling free of the French Empire. Now, things for the North Africans in France were a lot worse than they are now. North Africa is quite a distance away from Syria. You know, they do have different cultures. They're both Arab, but there is, you know, there are differences. And I find it suspicious that, you know, people can be self-radicalized in a week. We heard about the guy who plowed through all of those people. He was a hedonist, apparently. He was, you know, he didn't have a beard. He used to drink and this, that, and the other. And then in a period of 8 days, he managed to grow a beard. I don't know how I don't know how you can grow a beard, full beard in 8 days. I'm not sure. And then he just, like that, he turned into a radical. And it kind of puts this fear into our heads that anyone could, you know, do something bad, whether they're Muslim, religious Muslim, non-religious Muslim, whether they're English, whether they're whatever. And I don't think it's very constructive, and I'm suspicious of what's going on. In order to actually comment on specific events, we'd have to look at those events, and you probably have to have a full show on the Paris shootings, showing all the videos and all that kind of thing.
This is the problem, Zed. It's when I decided to investigate the Didcot murders, which I know it's probably something different. I think prior to that had been the Tunisian shootings. Yeah. Right. And people were saying, "Oh, investigate that." Well, that means me with limited resources. I've got to go there, spend however long there, find witnesses. It's not. You need some fair resources to be able to, let's say you're going to investigate the Paris attacks and try and find out what really happened and who really planned them. That is a massive operation to do that, to
Absolutely.
try and track down witnesses and find out what really happened. That's why I chose the Didcot thing, because it was fairly close
by.
Small number of people connected to witnesses, so I thought it's something that's within my scope, right? And I think I found out something which is not, the media have got it wrong, in my opinion.
And look what you did, you completely exposed that the narrative, your narrative to me, sounds a lot more reasonable than the mainstream media's narrative, definitely.
But all of these events, they need that kind of level of detailed investigation independently.
Absolutely.
In order to find out what
yeah,
really happened.
we need 10, 20, 100 Richard D. Halls in the country, essentially. If more people could follow your kind of investigative journalist methods all around the country, we would be getting somewhere, definitely. But we need to do it before these freedom of speech bills, get tightened around us, because, we're living in this environment where it's getting increasingly harder to speak your mind. And I think, will we be able to have this kind of conversation 10 years from now? Who knows?
All right, then, Zaid. Thanks for all your comments. We are going to do another show where we're going to talk about the Middle East again, and also the whole world, basically. But thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
On the previous show, we talked about fabricated terror or staged terrorism and how this is being used in the Middle East and in other areas as a means of political control and to obtain power. Today, we are going to discuss world power, and I'd like to welcome back onto the show Zaid. Welcome back, Zaid.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, now you just wanted me to show a clip of a lecture that I gave, I think, about 2.5 years ago, when I was talking about countries and world power. So we'll just take a look at that as a means of introducing today's show. Now, if you just look at a map of the world for a second, in geography books we often see this kind of map where we have different coloured regions representing different countries. I find this type of map extremely misleading, and I would say it's even untruthful, because what it suggests is that each of these coloured regions are autonomous, so they're in charge of their own decisions, and I don't think that's the case. I think the vast majority of countries in the world are actually subservient to the United States or possibly China and Russia. Now, the globalist map, I think, would look completely different to this. It maybe be only a handful of areas on the globalist, the people who are carrying out this globalist agenda. Okay, so do you want to make a point about what I'm saying there?
Yeah, so it's a very good point to make. The world map kind of shows state boundaries, but it doesn't show where the power lies, essentially, and which side's which. Obviously, on the previous show we discussed that I wasn't a believer in a grand conspiracy. I think there are different power structures in the world. Every group of people are vying for power, whether that's Freemasons or religions, this, that, and the other. I do think there are discrete groups of interests. There are areas where those interests overlap. And I think it might be, interesting to build on the previous show to discuss how the power structures work in the Middle East at this moment in time.
Zaid has listed 19 Middle Eastern countries, and he's grouped some of them. And we're going to go through them and discuss their significance in terms of world power. So we can put some maps up on the screen as we're discussing this. So you wanted to start with Israel.
Yeah, well, we can start with America, really, because it's reasonable to say that America is in control of the world today as we know it. It's still the most powerful state on the planet. It still wields considerable, economic and military power. There are military bases all over the world, interests in most of the countries on the planet. So I would argue that it's reasonable to say that America is the world power of today. I would also argue, when we look at Israel, it's reasonable to say that Israel exerts a certain amount of control on America. And the logic behind this is because, quite simply, the sheer number of dual US-Israeli citizens who are in key positions of the American power structure, the powerful Zionist lobby, the incredible amount of aid, the $3.1 billion in aid that Israel receives, which is then recycled to support that lobbying power structure, and also the grassroots support of the American, fundamentalist Christians, the Pentecostals, and it's kind of like a unholy alliance of people with differing ideologies about the end times. The fundamentalist Christians believe that you need all the Jews in Israel back in Israel, before the Messiah comes, and unfortunately the majority of the Jews in Israel are going to be annihilated, save for the just few, like the 144,000. So it's kind of like the ideology behind this arrangement is kind of sick, really, when you really think about it. There are economic interests, but I'd mainly say there's a large religious motivation and a cultural motivation involved in that.
Right. So we've got a country of 8 million, Israel,
which receives 3.1 billion in aid. If you look at the countries scaled to the foreign military aid they receive from the US, Israel is a country of 8 million people. It receives 3.1 billion in aid. Let's compare it with.
So we've got a map here where the amount of aid, military aid, that these Middle Eastern countries get is represented by the size of the country here.
Yeah, and it's not the true size of the nation. No. So if we compare Israel to Pakistan, Pakistan has a population of 180 million, but it only receives 280 million in military aid. This is military aid we're talking about. I would say that military aid is a good yardstick to use to show power structures. I wouldn't say economic or what we call developmental aid is a good yardstick, because it doesn't show you the nuances of what's really happening in the background. Particularly countries like Africa who receive aid, they're paralysed by interest payments and all that kind of thing. So if we just talk about economic and developmental aid, it's probably not a good indicator. But military aid, if you look at the two biggest Middle Eastern countries on that map, you see the first one is Israel, 3.1 billion, and you see the second one is Egypt of 1.3 billion. So, just by looking at that, you can see who the strategic partners are in that region.
Okay. So tell us how Jordan fits into the jigsaw.
Yeah, so I started with Israel and America, essentially, because a lot of these other countries are ruled by that power structure, and Jordan is one of those countries. The history of Jordan, the name Jordan comes from the River Jordan, which runs north down to south, down through the land of, what we'd call Canaan. In Arabic, it's called Bilad al-Sham. It's the Levant. That's another name for it. So it's a river that provides a lot of water to the region and fertility. The west side of the river is where you have Palestine and that kind of area, and it's a very fertile. It's part of the Fertile Crescent. So the Fertile Crescent goes from Mesopotamia through Iraq, and it kind of bounds around, and it goes down to Palestine at the other end. And this is where the majority of the population of the Levant used to live. Well, they still do. When the Zionist project came into fruition, the population of this area got expelled from the fertile area, and they basically had to live in the desert, essentially. There was obviously a period where the West Bank existed.
So when you say the Zionist project come to fruition, are you talking about after the Second World War and the state of Israel? Is that what you mean?
So all the way from the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, there was this project, obviously, of European Jews, particularly from places like Germany, Poland, Central Europe, that kind of thing, immigrating to Israel and populating it. So it was kind of like it's a mass immigration, essentially, and the population reached a point where obviously the local population realised what was happening, and that the violence started, inter-ethnic violence and all that kind of thing. So when Israel declared itself a state, most of the Palestinians, they were robbed of their land. One of the Zionist arguments is that, a people without a land for a land without a people, that the land didn't have any people living in it. And there's this preposterous argument that the Palestinians are from like Egypt and places like that, and Jordan, and they all kind of ran into Israel as soon as it was founded, and it's just absolutely preposterous. That's the fertile area where most of the civilization was. So again, it's the same theme as the Gulf states. Prior to oil being discovered, the Gulf states were nothing really. They couldn't support a large population. They had no geostrategic value, and the same applies to Jordan. Jordan lies on the east side of the Jordan River. So whereas the west side is very fertile, the east side approaches the Syrian desert, and it's not as fertile, and it can't sustain a very large population. So it's always been a backwater area, part of that area. So the state of Jordan essentially, we used to be called Transjordan. It owes its existence to a lot of these disasters. Essentially, I think from a Western point of view, it was kind of convenient place to house all of these Palestinians who'd been expelled from their lands. And the disasters in Iraq and Syria following that brought middle-class Iraqis who brought the capital and moved to Jordan, and then they invested in Jordan. And the same with Syria as well. So the capital city, Amman, it's kind of exploded, over the years, and it thrives off these kind of disasters, where it's just a desert. There was hardly anything there. I think Amman housed Circassian refugees who from the North Caucasus who were expelled when Russia invaded. But apart from that, there was nothing much there. So again, the Jordanian monarchy, they owe their existence to this kind of this disaster essentially. Jordan wouldn't have any strategic value, and King Abdullah of Jordan, he presides over all of this.
It has a royal family, so does that mean it's controlled by the West still, or is it independent?
Yeah, Jordan's royal family is it's a puppet, power structure. Nobody's fooled by it. The population of Jordan are well aware of who Abdullah's real masters are. Abdullah's father, King Hussein of Jordan, he was a well-known intelligence asset. He received, like $1 million a year from the CIA, and he, it was very friendly with that power structure. His son Abdullah wasn't actually the heir to the throne. The actual heir was a guy called Prince Talal, and who a couple of weeks before Hussein died, he transferred the inheritance to his son Abdullah, who is he's British establishment through and through. He's gone to all of the like the Sandhurst, places like that. He's served in the British Army as like a second lieutenant or something like that. He's also been to US military schools, things like that. He's the man that they want essentially. And he presides over this country that is just housing Palestinians, and very largely Palestinians are second-class citizens essentially. There were obviously he married, his wife's a Palestinian, and this is the fact that he married a Palestinian is probably a move to kind of placate the population. The Queen's Palestinian and the King is Jordanian, but Abdullah is in no way. To say that Jordan's a sovereign state is just laughable, which is why it's red on this map. It was completely a tool of the US-Israel power structure. During one of the crises, Abdullah's dog needed veterinary help, and they rushed it to Israel clandestinely, essentially, for them to sort out. So there were these backdoor kind of, and the population, the Jordanian population is well aware of this, but they're very afraid of the power structure in Jordan. There is a very domineering building in Amman that is kind of where the police, the government police and all that kind of thing kind of operate from. So the population is ruled through fear, essentially.
Right. So the countries that you've drawn in red on this map are, I don't like to use the word controlled, but they're part of the American-Israeli project, if you like.
Yeah.
Because they've got leaders that you would say are subservient to certain genders that they're trying to carry out?
They're not sovereign states by any means. I mean, on the map, I haven't put Iran, Russia, and Syria as the same colour. I haven't, because the relationship that Russia has with Iran, for instance, isn't the same kind of relationship that the US has with Turkey. Russia and Iran have kind of shared interests, but there's no kind of controlling power structure where if the Iranians do something that the Russians don't like, a coup happens. There's just nothing like that. So the countries that I've labelled in red are absolutely 100% controlled from the same power structure. Even if some of the leaders may purport to say something. For instance, to show you the kind of support that Abdullah has, when ISIS burns the Jordanian pilot alive, Jewish press did this kind of campaign to kind of improve his image as this kind of hard man, this strong man essentially, and he was dressed in military gear, and he was standing like that, looking all tough, and it said something about Abdullah's going to respond to the ISIS threat. He's going to be relentless in his pursuit of them. First of all, the guy's 5'5". He's tiny. He wouldn't intimidate a little girl. Yeah. Second of all, Jordan doesn't have a particularly large military. It's only marginally larger, than a country like Lebanon. It doesn't need a large military, really. It needs a military structure to control the population. But Jordan's never been used to kind of wage campaigns on behalf of the power structures the way maybe Turkey has, for instance. And thirdly, the last point of that is that Jordan works for the same people who are responsible for ISIS. So the idea that it's some kind of crusader fighting ISIS is just ludicrous. It's all that is theatre. So this is you've talked about theatre. I think between me and you, I would disagree at how high that theatre goes. I think theatre goes up to a point, but I don't think Russia's controlled by another power. Right. But definitely a perfect example of theatre is King Abdullah of Jordan. It doesn't fool anyone. I'll add another point to that. The morale in Jordan, any military officer with half a brain isn't going to fight for a king who they know who's really in control essentially. Right. So they're not going to fight for this person when they know exactly who they're actually fighting for. Right. So it's like he couldn't wage a campaign against anybody. Right. What he can do is he can terrorize his own citizens, and he can keep the Palestinians down, and keep them there for as long as possible while Israel establishes itself, and just hope that the Palestinians forget where they came from, essentially. Right. So
you wanted to. We spoke about Turkey on the previous show, and we said that there's this attempted coup which looks like it went wrong, and has pushed Turkey possibly towards Russia.
Yeah.
So you've got it marked in red there as still being under control or under the influence of US and Israel. So why is Turkey a red country?
So if you put yourself in the shoes of a global leader who goes into power, and that leader goes into the power of a country that is already under the influence of another country, let's say the United States, you can't just go into the country and then immediately kick out all of the NGOs, all of the the embassy staff, all of the foreign subversive threats, because they're going to go for it straight away. What I think's happened is Erdogan, he has actually kind of bided his time, and he's trying to solidify his control over the country before he finally kicks out these threats once and for all. And we can see that in certain things that have happened. So it's still in red because Turkey is by no means it's still part of NATO. It still does a lot. It still works on behalf of those powers. So who knows? It might change. It might go the way of Iran. Iran, obviously, we discussed in the last show, was an asset that turned into a very staunch enemy. So who knows what's going to happen in the next few months?
Right. So it's a fairly big country. Well, you said I think 100 million last time.
I can't remember off the top of my head.
75 million.
Yeah, more like that.
In
60, 70 million.
So we come to a more medium-sized country. Azerbaijan, which is 9.4 million, still more than Israel and Jordan, so fairly significant. So you've got that as a red country as well. So tell us a little bit about Azerbaijan.
So Azeris, they speak Turkish essentially. It's called Azeri, but it's kind of a dialect of Turkey. The Turkish language spread to Anatolia through the Caucasus. There was a migration of Turkish-speaking peoples, and there was the Seljuk invasion of the Anatolian Peninsula. So countries like Azerbaijan and Turkey kind of the represent this movement of these people essentially. So the Azeris, the Caucasians, like anyone else, just as the Turks are Anatolians, they just speak a Turkish language. And because obviously these two countries share this language and they share aspects of culture, they're very much one and the same. Azerbaijan's very reliant on Turkey. It's also strategically linked with Israel, to the point where Azerbaijan, it's well known that Azerbaijan will host Israeli fighter jets and refuel them in the event of an attack against Iran. And the other aspect of that is there are a lot of Azeri people in the northwest of Iran. So Azerbaijan, as we see it, used to be part of the Iranian Empire, the Qajar dynasty. So it broke off. So there's that kind of animosity there. But it is well and truly even though it's a Muslim country, it's got a very close relationship with Israel, and it's got a very close relationship with the United States and Turkey.
So the next group of countries, well, you've grouped together the next countries: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman.
Yeah.
So tell us first, why have you put them in one group? Do they have a common theme?
Well, they are on the Arabian Peninsula. They are, the actual Arab states. They share a lot of history. They're very sparsely populated. They're all part of this kind of Islamic backwater, essentially, with the exception of Oman. They're all part of this kind of, when Islam started and the Muslims kind of spread out, they took over the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, and they took all over those areas. Pretty much as soon as they went into those areas, the capital, the Islamic capital, moved from Mecca and Medina to Baghdad, and it changed hands with Damascus, Cairo. So the Islam spread out. The centres of learning and a lot of the centre of economy, the centres of the population were all based in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. Mm-hmm. So throughout history, Arabia is important in the sense that it is where Islam started. But after Islam started, the power structure then moved to the actual Fertile Crescent and the Mesopotamia and the Nile river areas. So throughout history, it was nothing much happened, and then with the discovery of oil.
So these countries were all vastly affected by the discovery and the mining of oil.
Yeah, absolutely. For instance, a lot of these countries.
Say that, is that why they're predominantly, that you would say, in league with America, because they've got this asset?
They owe everything to America. I don't want to be offensive to those areas, but they're the facts.
Did you want to come on to Yemen later, or are you happy to mention that now?
Yeah. There's a civil war going on in Yemen, so we can't really put Yemen into any particular camp until that civil war has been won or lost by whatever side. What unites all of these countries is that they had a very strong relationship with the United Kingdom. And then, touched upon this last show, after World War II, the UK was facing a lot of financial difficulties, and the mantle of world power had been passed on to the United States. And this happened in various requests. For instance, the UK couldn't support Greece anymore, and it put a formal request to the United States to kind of take over the support. And this is what started the relationship between the US and Greece and Turkey, and the whole Cold War strategy. So with the Saudi states, they had this very productive relationship with Britain, which then evolved into a relationship with the United States. So the Saudi government has had a long history with the United States. It's fueled the American empire to give it the lifeblood that it needs, which is oil. And in return, these countries get, they have, they get security from other entities.
And they buy military.
They buy military equipment. Big cities have appeared in the United Arab Emirates. That all of these big steel and concrete constructions, it's able to support large populations. So the Gulf states are well and truly part of that Western power structure. Yeah.
So we've got Yemen. There's obviously possibly changes going on there now, so we don't quite know where to put that. But Iran is firmly out of this group, you would say.
Absolutely. Iran is one of the few countries on this map that
you think definitely isn't part of what I was saying, that this each country seems to be part of. It's not aligned with Russia.
Yeah.
You think it is?
It is aligned with Russia, but it's not controlled by Russia.
Right.
I didn't want to do a red versus blue map because the power structures, the influence that Russia has over a lot of these other countries isn't as strong as the influence that America has over the Saudi countries, Egypt, Turkey. Potentially in the future, Russia might have that relationship. Russia's definitely wielded considerable power over states that border it. Georgia, Armenia. Russia had a lot of power in these states, but there's a power grab on the side of the Western nations in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus to take that Russian influence away from them. So Iran is, after the 1979 revolution, well and truly, it doesn't have. It's a sovereign state. We could say all of these different things, but it's an indigenous government that's actually ruling it. You can't say it's a sovereign state. Where you can't say that Jordan's a sovereign state by any means. And unless, if anyone has any proof that Iran is controlled by another power, I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, or kind of theories over what could happen. That'd be very interesting. But yeah.
So do you think the current situation that's been created in Syria, let's say that Syria was to turn red as the colour you have it on your map, it's sort of the ultimate goal is to then move into Iraq. Move into Iran.
Yeah, Iran is the ultimate target. Iran and Russia are the ultimate targets because they represent a threat to geopolitical interests. If Syria falls the same way as the other states and it's red and it's no longer sovereign, it has effect on pipelines. It has effect on many different things, and definitely I think a lot of people would argue that Iran is in the firing line from both the US and Israel. All of this is in preparation for an attack against Iran. You wouldn't go against Iran directly. Iraq was they went to Iraq first, then they went for Syria, and they're trying to encircle Iran completely before they go after it again. And unfortunately, if that does happen, it's going to be another scenario where we're going to have hundreds of thousands of people dying and all kinds of bloodshed.
So what does green denote on the map then?
So I've given Iran and Syria two different colours because really, I didn't want to make this a map of different sides. I just wanted to show which ones were the sovereign states, which ones were part of the Western power structure, and which ones are kind of swing states. So at one point, the Caucasian states would have been part of the Russian power structure, but after certain events that are happening in Georgia and Armenia, there is a kind of a swing happening. Armenia possibly, you could put that as an independent state, but there are NGOs in Armenia. There are elements trying to get influence.
So the grey colour denotes what?
It's a swing. It's in swing. Right. It's essentially civil war.
Right. So there's some change.
Yeah.
You've got Syria in a different colour.
Yeah.
That meaning that it's aligned with Russia, is it?
No. It is. Yeah. Syria is aligned with Russia. It's Syria owes its existence right now to Russia. If Russia wasn't there, Syria would have fallen, years ago.
Right.
Assad owes his existence to Putin.
Right. Right.
There are Russian soldiers in Syria. There are Russians fighting in Syria. So yeah.
Right. And we haven't mentioned Lebanon.
Lebanon's a strange case because there is a government in Lebanon. But there's also Hezbollah, who wield a lot of control in that country. So I've put Lebanon as grey because it's got this government within a government. It's got the Hezbollah power structure, and it's also got the government, which is proven very impotent whenever it's been invaded by Israel. It's proven very ineffective. The government's there. It represents the different kind of different groups, different religious groups and cultural groups of Beirut, but it's pretty. It's not very powerful. I mean, the real power in Lebanon comes from Hezbollah.
Right, and well, we haven't got it marked on the map there. I don't know if it's considered as part of the Middle East, but Libya, we know that Gaddafi was deposed. So you would, if you were extending this map west, would you include Libya?
I'd say, yeah, Libya's under the power of the West. You could make it grey potentially. I haven't included it in the map because Libya is part of North Africa, essentially, not necessarily part of the Middle East. But yeah, definitely, Gaddafi, he was doing things that were flying in the face of what the West wanted, so he needed to get out, and that's why they got rid of him. And they did it by arming people in Benghazi.
So let me ask you a hypothetical question then. Let's say they do to Assad what they did to Gaddafi in this, on someone's phone, where there's this gruesome public execution of the leader, right? Let's say that happened, hypothetically, right? Which I suppose it could. What would Putin do?
The Russians have historically, America at times in history have called Russia's bluff, and Russia's never quite, it's always backed down before America, essentially. That's what I'd say. You know, in the Arab-Israeli wars, Russia backed down. It could have offered more help, but it tended to back down more quicker. If that happened, if Damascus fell, I doubt there's much the Russians could do about it. They'd obviously strengthen the defences of Iran. They'd obviously try and increase their influence in the Caucasus and in Anatolia and Turkey, but I doubt there's much they could do. But it all depends on who would actually invade Damascus in order to do that, because at the moment the tide seems to be turning against the Islamic State that are in the north.
Right. Do you think that there's possibly people from all sides having negotiations that we never see, like the G20 and things like this that you see publicly on the news? To me, they're just probably rubber stamping things that have already been agreed in private. They're not real discussions, in other words. They're just signing things that have already been agreed. So do you think that Putin's staff or his entourage are maybe in communication with the US and Israel and other countries saying, well, look, we want Syria. What would you take, Putin, if you allow us to have Syria? What would it take for you to just step back and let us in? Do you not think they're having that kind of chessboard type discussion?
I don't see any evidence of that. I really don't. All the evidence I see is of different power structures vying for power.
Right.
I don't see that. Right.
Okay. And have you got any predictions for the near future or the middle future? What do you think?
So I predicted to you that Turkey would switch sides, and it did happen. The BBC News was reporting it and all that kind of thing. Definite prediction is look for more trouble in Anatolia, in Turkey itself. Look, more terrorist attacks. Again, I warned you about that the terrorist attacks would increase, and they did. All kinds of strife. Also in Caucasus, look for difficulties in Armenia and in Georgia, which there have been before. That's the main area I think the concentration is going to happen on. There was a story about the ISIS terrorists being granting safe passage out of Syria. Where are they going? Where's the safe passage to?
Okay, well, what I might ask you to do, Zaid, if you're willing to do it for me, is because you've obviously got a lot of knowledge of the sort of past conflicts between all of these nations and what the current state of play is. If you could draw me a world map, so in red there, we'll just class that as one group, one country. So we've got all these Arabian states along with Egypt and Turkey, whatever. That's US and Israel will be all one country, yeah? And then you've got Russia with certain allies. You draw me a world map, yeah? And we'll put that on the screen at the end of the show.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, and then we can perhaps...
It'll be mostly red.
Right, yeah, well, it seems to be.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you shouldn't have chose that colour because traditionally it's Russian, isn't it?
Yeah, but I wanted to symbolise.
Right.
If we just look at the sheer number of American military bases, that's going to tell you, if a country has got another country's military bases in it, that's a good definition to show that it's under the power of a country. If a country's hosting another country's nuclear defences, they're completely geostrategically aligned.
Yeah.
There's no way about that. If we were seeing Turkey really switching sides, you'd see it leaving NATO, you'd see any hope of it joining the European Union being dashed, you'd see the nuclear weapons being taken out of Incirlik and places in the south. You would see that, but we're not seeing that yet. The show isn't over in terms of Turkey. Because
obviously, if we extend this to the world, you're going to have fun with South America, trying to work out there, and Africa. But see how you get on.
Yeah, and it can be argued that some of the South American leaders who were able to rebel were able to do that because the emphasis was put away from South America onto other regions like the Middle East. I mean, especially during the Vietnam era, the way the US acted in the Middle East is a lot different to the way it is now, because the US was tied up in Vietnam completely. It couldn't do the same kind of couldn't put the same kind of military pressure. That is why the United States renegotiated Egypt getting the Sinai Peninsula back from Israel. So Israel, there was a war, it took the Sinai Peninsula. The United States negotiated that out because the United States couldn't afford to have this kind of strife because of the potential of Russia coming straight in and taking control.
Right, well, okay, I think it's a good exercise to try and do this map, which is what I was kind of alluding to in my lecture. But if you could limit it to as few colours as possible.
Yeah.
And maybe if you to get such a map, it then perhaps can help people's understanding as to why there's fabricated events in certain parts of the world, because it's where the boundaries are, isn't
it? Absolutely.
And there might be some seemingly insignificant country, but it's not really, because it's on a frontier between certain large interests.
Yeah.
All right, and Zaid, is there anything else you want to add?
I think that's good.
All right, well, thanks very much indeed for coming in again.